Right, I'm David Stenhouse. I'm the CEO of the John Schofield Trust. And one of the best things about my job is I get to see the email registrations flooding in for when we announce our masterclasses. And they certainly have been over the last few days. We have more than 200 people joining us tonight, which is testimony to the pooling power exerted by Reeta Chakrabarti and Chris Mason, our guests tonight. Zaiba Malik is going to be chairing the event. If you have questions during it, please post them in the Q&A box, which is right at the bottom of the screen, and Zaiba will pick some of those and relay them to our guests. The John Schofield Trust is blessed by the fact that people give their time to us for free, and Chris and Reeta are doing that tonight. We are a charity, and if you feel able to support our important work, supporting the next generation of young journalists and growing diversity in the newsrooms of British broadcasting, any donation you feel able to make would be very gratefully received, and you can do that by going to our website and press the donate button. As they say in my part of the world, money a mickle, max a muckle. So enjoy this evening, and I'm delighted to pass you over to Zaiba Malik.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, and a very warm welcome to our audience this evening, and indeed a very warm welcome to Chris and to Reeta as well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I can see, Chris, that looks like you're still at work. Hopefully, Reeta, you're at home in your comfortable home surroundings. So yes, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's been a very busy day with Tim Davie at the BBC announcing quite significant changes with big moves in news and other programmings as well. It looks like there's going to be unfortunately more redundancies at the BBC, and also aligned with that as well, a bigger move out of London, which many may welcome. So thank you both very much for joining us tonight. I just want to start by taking you back to Halloween. I'm sure it's a night you both remember, a night when you both had to fill in very extensively, and you did it so brilliantly for quite a long time. I think it was kind of going on for about 3 hours, as we were all waiting that Saturday evening for Boris Johnson to come into live and announce the kind of latest lockdown announcement. So let's play a small clip of that, and then we'll discuss your ability to deal with that kind of turmoil, basically. So yes, if we just play a short clip.
Apologies, got a mic error.
Data slides, yes, they will show that the regional picture around England is variable, but they will also show how it is increasing substantially everywhere. And I suspect the point will be made that unless action is taken pretty imminently, there would have been a huge threat in terms of the NHS's capacity being overcome. The Prime Minister, we know, did not want to have to reach this moment. He was a keen advocate and a passionate advocate of the regional tiered approach. And with that took quite a lot of political heat. You'll remember the conversations, the arguments, the very public, angry arguments.
I'm going to stop you, Chris.
He's there.
Yes, I think it's fair to say, Reeta, you can really hear the relief in your voice at that point. Is thank God is the Prime Minister. He's turned up after all this time. Can you both maybe just talk me through that? So obviously we knew that there was going to be this significant announcement. I just wanted to get some context and sense of, what you were prepared for and actually what happened in reality. So maybe if we could start off with you, Reeta, just kind of give us your perspective on that particular evening, please.
Well, when I recall this day, I always say to people, I'm really pleased that I didn't know what was about to happen when I walked through the revolving doors into New Broadcasting House. We had no idea, of course, what was ahead of us. We knew there was a press conference. I was due to go on the air at 4 o'clock, and we thought that the presser was going to start at 4:30. It was a Saturday, so generally speaking, it's a smaller staff in the newsroom on Saturday, but a very capable staff. And the press conference strand was being edited by Tom Goulbourne, who's a senior producer, very experienced, very calm person. And he said, listen, if they run late a little bit, we've got lots of good interviews lined up, so you can just interview them at length. I have to warn you that we haven't got very many packages. So those pieces that you can go to if things are overrunning a little bit, he did warn me in advance that we didn't have very much in the way of that. So he said, well, you might have to pad a little bit, but with any luck, even if they're not there for 4:30, they'll be there for 4:45. 4:30 came and went, and they didn't come on. I think I got the message that, well, it's looking more like 4:45. 4:45 came and went, still hadn't come on. Then it became 5 o'clock, and so on and so on. And eventually it became apparent that we weren't going to get them before the 6 o'clock news. And because it's a Saturday, ordinarily the news channel or the continuous coverage and the bulletins on BBC One are covered separately. But because it was a Saturday, it was my job to do both of them. And you usually have a fair amount of time to prepare for the 6 o'clock news, because you're very involved in the 6 o'clock news. You write the headlines, you write the top introduction, you rewrite lots of the cues, but there was no way that I could get out of the studio to do that. So I went straight from doing the news channel and the continuous stuff on BBC One straight into the 6 o'clock news, almost blind, if you like, and they still hadn't come on. Luckily, we had some very, very good interviews lined up. People like Neil Ferguson from Imperial, Davy Sridhar from the University of Edinburgh. These are people that I would ordinarily have interviewed for 4 or 5 minutes. Now, I haven't gone back and looked at quite how long I went on with them, but I mean, I think it was definitely double that time. And I was very aware that the message was coming from the newsroom that, Reeta, we haven't got anything else we can go to. So there was no question but that we had to keep it going. And marvelously, our interviewees rose to the challenge. And the other person I had, of course, was the inestimable Chris Mason, who can talk for England on most topics. And when it comes to coronavirus and lockdown, as you saw, he talked and he talked and he talked. And of course, I mean, he'll tell you more about this, but it became not only the substance of what Boris Johnson was going to announce, but the whole business of quite why it was running so late anyway. I'll let him talk about that. I'll say one other thing, which is that I've gradually became aware that, the news audience is a very loyal audience, but it's also a particular group of people. And we were on BBC One with people tuning in, ready to watch Little Mix the Search, and then also wondering what was happening to Strictly. And in the few moments where I could check Twitter, I had all these people who would normally never be watching us saying, who's this? What's going on? Where's Little Mix? So that added a completely surreal element to what was already quite a surreal situation.
Well, I'm sure it's fair to say you kind of completely earned your crust that evening, Reeta. So yeah, thank you. And Chris, your memories of that night, were you obviously both very swan-like? Do you panic in a situation like that, or do you think, okay, this is what I do? I can fill for a significant amount of time.
It was an extraordinary privilege to do it. It's funny, actually, recalling or listening to Rita's recollections. I do remember saying on the air at about 20 to 7, which was about 5 minutes before that moment we just played you of Boris Johnson arriving, that as a viewer, you would be turning on expecting either the Prime Minister or Little Mix, and instead got Rita and I repeating ourselves over and over again. The extraordinary thing, I mean, Rita's absolutely right, that if someone had told me as I came through the revolving doors of Broadcasting House on Saturday lunchtime that's what we'd end up doing, I might have just kept on going through the revolving door until I could carry on back to the tube station. Because the extraordinary thing I think about it was well, we didn't know what was going on and when it was going to happen. The word imminent is the most elastic in Westminster, and we learnt that lesson the hard way that afternoon. But I think the other thing was that we were fortunate in that Reeta and I spend a lot of time, Reeta as a presenter, me as a correspondent, on the BBC News channel, where rolling news is obviously the very reason for its existence. We have got used to in the last year these COVID press conferences often not quite being on time, although often, as Reeta was saying, the slippage would be 5 or 10 minutes, not the best part of 3 hours. But what we had on that night, and we've had on other occasions too, but it was particularly striking that night because of the gravity of the announcement that was about to come. It seems a long time ago now, but it was the announcement of lockdown 2 in England. Is that BBC One were taking the programme, and because they had anticipated it happening at 4:30, BBC One joined us at 4:30 and stuck with us until strictly at 7:10. So the audience figures, I mean, not that it makes any difference in and of the moment when you're sitting in that studio, because you're just broadcasting, you're just getting on with it. But the audience figures were absolutely astonishing. I don't think I'll ever broadcast to as big an audience ever again. My local paper back home in Yorkshire summed it up. I've taken a cutting of this and put it on my wall at home that said something like, local lad Chris waffles for Britain in front of 16 million people or whatever. And that was kind of the essence of it. But I very much saw my role as trying to, well, help Reeta where I could, be a presenter's friend, to use the sort of jargon, which is that when Reeta was not doing an interview or not talking into one of the recorded packages, or perhaps needed a bit of briefing from the gallery about a forthcoming interview, I would just talk and talk and talk. And thankfully there was enough to talk about, because there was plenty leaking out of the cabinet meeting that had happened earlier in the day. I was getting texts about what was going on. And in that sort of instance, you've got proper hard facts and you've got people joining you all the time, and there's nothing wrong with repeating yourself, thankfully.
Were you both getting direction in your ears, and just in terms of how to move it along? Because repetition is all very good, but I suppose there's only so many times you can actually repeat something. So just in terms of refreshing it, in terms of orchestrating that very lengthy session.
I wasn't on talkback, but Reeta obviously was, but I wasn't.
I was, but Zaiba, to a certain extent, we were running out of material. I mean, nobody anticipated that it would go on for this long. So what did happen was that we would be running these interviews at great length, and as I say, mercifully, they were, they talked to the point, and they were very informative. And then the story became about the delay itself, and I think that was pertinent, wasn't it, Chris? Because these were the texts that you were receiving about why the delay.
Oh, completely.
Because usually we don't like processology, do we? But actually, this time it was really important.
Yeah. Normally you would shy away from that kind of processology because it'd be a fairly niche interest. But ultimately, we had to offer an explanation, didn't we, about why it was that people who were turned on and were hearing us saying that this is imminent at various points, and then half an hour later they're still watching and they're thinking, well, it isn't, is it? When's it actually going to happen? What really struck me, actually, as I was reflecting on tonight a little earlier today, was one particular moment with hindsight where I should have perhaps spotted that we were in for quite a slog, which was you and I, Reeta, in the studio at about 10 to 5, when we were still hoping it was going to happen at around about 5 o'clock. And I think I said on the air that it's going to happen at around about 5 o'clock. And I was thinking, I'm being quite cautious here. I'm not going to say at 5 o'clock, because these things often slip by a few minutes. And I had a text whilst, Reeta, I think you were talking to an interviewee, or perhaps talking to Hugh Pym or Nick Triggle, one of the other correspondents, where somebody in Downing Street who was clearly watching us said, Chris, when you say around 5 o'clock, I think you'd be better saying from 5 o'clock. Now, it's the job of a political correspondent to be able to dissect language. And I thought, I think that's a gentle hint, because around could be 5, or it could be 5 past, or it could be 10 past. From, I'm thinking that suggests it's going to slip a little bit. But of course, I didn't want to say anything that I couldn't substantiate. So I didn't want to say it slipped by half an hour, because they weren't willing to say that. Eventually, I managed to get out of them. It won't happen until the other side of 6 o'clock. I think I was able to say that on the air at about 5:15. And meantime, we were to later discover there were all sorts of negotiations going on at a higher level within the BBC and Downing Street around the imminence of Strictly, which is live and is complicated, particularly in a COVID secure scenario as they were. And in the end, that did mean that if they were going to do this press conference live on BBC One before about 9 o'clock in the evening, they were going to have to do it by about 6:45. But yeah, I mean, in many ways, when I reflect on it, I don't know how you feel about it, Rita, it was just a tremendous broadcasting privilege, really. It was entirely chance that it happened to be me doing it as a political correspondent. It was just a quirk of the rota. But it was a great privilege to do it.
You were both obviously very, very comfortable doing it. And I think, that's obviously very visible to see, and you reacted to that pressure extremely well. If you need another job, I think Little Mix are looking for maybe another member. I think one of their members left quite recently. So I'm sure that Rita and Chris, you're well lined in for a job there. I just want to ask you, so we obviously have people who are strongly involved in the trust. So we have a question coming in, and so please do keep your questions coming in. Do you both think that you're kind of in current times in terms of what's taught, either in journalism courses or actually, both of you kind of at the BBC? Is it kind of integral in your learning that you're taught about broadcasting and doing live specifically, or is it a case that you just learn on the job, basically? I remember from my days in newsrooms, I think you could pretty much put reporters into two categories: those that love doing lives and those that would run a mile from doing them. So I wonder if it's something you could give us some advice on, just in terms of how you learn to present or report in a live situation.
After you, Rita.
Oh gosh, well, so I didn't go to journalism school. I did a straightforward academic degree and then joined the BBC on a training scheme. But the training scheme was not really broadcasting skills because it was a radio production scheme. So I am somebody who learned on the job, who learned by watching other people, by asking their advice. Doing lives is always the most terrifying thing when you start out. And I think doing TV lives particularly, because at least with radio, you've got the crutch of your notes, haven't you? Whereas with TV, although I think these days, actually, more than before, it is much more acceptable to be looking down at your notes. I mean, in a way, why shouldn't you? They're just a prompt. But what you can't do is just to be reading out the piece, the 1 minute 15 that you've written already, or actually in our case, the 3 hours that you've not written already. So you do, like everything, experience brings its own confidence. You learn your own style, and the best way of doing it is to be as much like yourself on screen as you are off screen. I will caveat that by saying that there is a certain amount of, you become your TV persona on the telly that we both, have. And I would say I spent 20, maybe 25 years as a correspondent before I became a presenter. And the presenter persona was slightly different from the correspondent one. I can't tell you exactly how, but I do know that I am something a little bit different from, what I am if I'm out in the field. What else, really? I think, there is also a difference between doing the sort of lives, and I was the presenter, so I'll let Chris talk about his 2 ways with me, where he was filling, but he couldn't just waffle. I mean, whatever the local paper said, he clearly wasn't waffling. It was all very pertinent and to the point. But there's a difference between doing that and doing the lives that Chris will do on BBC One, on the 6 and 10 o'clock newses, for example, which are a very tightly argued, analysed, scripted 1 minute 15, 1 minute 30. And the one bit of advice that sticks in my head from, I'm afraid, the mid-1990s, from a superb correspondent called Paul Newman, who I used to watch with awe. And I said to Paul, how do you do those lives then? Because he was terrific at them. He said, just make 3 points. 3 points. You don't need any more than that. The audience can't take anything more in. Just go boom, 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 and finish it off with a bit of analysis. And I hung on to those rules for years and years and years.
So what are your secrets that you can share, Chris? You have a very particular style, don't you? If we're talking about styles that of reporters, do you kind of just rely on your natural kind of instinct on a story? And again, just what kind of skill set do you think you could pass on to people who are watching in this evening who want to really focus on a career in broadcast journalism?
Well, it's fascinating hearing Rita's reflections, actually, and I learned from listening to Rita and hearing how you've approached it, Rita. I think in terms of going back to the whole business of live broadcasting, again, I kind of learned on the job. I did an academic undergrad degree, and then I was a trainee at ITN alongside a postgraduate journalism course. But I think ultimately, broadcasting and journalism more broadly, it's a trade, isn't it? And you get better with practice. It's practice. Air miles, I'm a huge believer in. I hate that kind of word that occasionally gets lobbed around in our industry when people talk about talent, which kind of assumes you've either got it or you haven't. I mean, that's just, in my view, complete nonsense. And I kind of feel like I know that because I know what I was like when I started. And I'm only, you're only as good as your last program or your last live, and you can do a dud at any point, but you get better with practice.
Are you allowed to get away with duds? I mean, how much scope is there?
Well, I mean, I think over
frankly,
time,
for making mistakes.
Well, I mean, you never want to make mistakes, particularly around facts, in terms of news reporting, because that's kind of indefensible. We do all make mistakes, but in terms of how you sort of develop as a broadcaster, either reporting or presenting, I do a bit of a mix of both. But my main role is as a correspondent. I think, practice, air miles. I think I like to think that over the course of a year, this year's worst live won't be as bad as last year's. In other words, you sort of, you oscillate. Of course you oscillate, but you hope over time your average sort of performance gets better. In terms of the art of live broadcasting as a reporter, Reeta makes it, for me, a really important distinction between something like the Halloween affair of 3 hours of ad-libbing, and something in the context of a built bulletin where you've got 50 seconds, 1 minute, 1:15, 1:30. And for me personally, because I come from a background of being a reporter on 5 Live, where I do loads and loads of ad-libbed, unscripted lives, which are often quite long, bluntly, I'm much more comfortable doing that and the kind of thing we ended up doing on Halloween than I am when I'm doing a sort of 1:30 thing where you have to give far, far more thought. I mean, I'm no good. I've tried it. If I try and script every word and learn every word, I just can't do it. I end up, when I'm on the air, I don't perform very well because my mind is thinking, what's the next sentence, rather than delivering the current sentence with conviction. And so now I just think about what I'm going to say and hope that I stick vaguely to time. And over time, you do build up a sense in your head as to what 1:20 feels like. And also the gallery will shout at you when you've got 10 seconds to go or whatever. But personally, I'm more comfortable with ad-libbed lives than ones that are more sort of scripted or in that sense sort of thought through word by word. But I think it's just practice. I love it. I love broadcasting. I love the joy of it. I think it's exhilarating. Rita's point, I think, is a really interesting one. I think I like to think of it as you've got to be yourself, but you've got to be yourself plus 10%, because it is a performance. You can't be yourself plus 50%, because then you'd be somebody else, and that'd just be weird, and particularly weird and exposing in a rolling news era. Maybe in the olden days, pre news channels, YouTube, 5 Live and all the rest of it, you could be a persona on screen that was very different from the real you. I think now with so much live broadcasting, that wouldn't be sustainable, and it'd be a bit odd and it'd be inauthentic. But I think, as I say, you have to be sort of plus 10% because it is a performance, and I think you've kind of got to you have to remember that.
And Reeta, I just, you said, of course, you spent many years, reporting, in community affairs and politics and education, and then moved to presenting. Has there been a significant difference in how you approach reporting, reporting from presenting in a studio?
They are two different things. There's a certain formality to presenting. On both the bulletins and on live and continuous, you're the sort of interface, if you like, between the audience and the reporter, the person who's bringing you the news from wherever. So you're sort of a friendly face or a friendly guide, or somebody who people switch on and they think, oh yes, it's her and she's going to tell me something interesting or distressing or whatever. So your role is a bit different from when you're actually bringing, when you're doing Chris's job, you're the expert, you're the person who knows, you're the person who can, not just reporting it, but you're analysing it, you're telling people what it means in as much as you can. Whereas when you're a presenter, it is rather different. You're just sort of laying stuff out for people and doing it in as approachable a way as possible. So I, sort of presenting, and again, the styles are also a little bit different. I think if the built bulletin, the 1, 6 and 10 is again slightly more formal. I mean, I think nothing like it was 30 years ago, but a a bit more of a sort of, this is our record of the day at these set points in the day, and there's a greater formality to it than there is on the news channel, which is more conversational, and there can be moments of sort of lightness and so on, which are less so on in a bulletin. And I just, but I think otherwise the principles of the journalism are the same. Accuracy, of course, is preeminent, but then for me, a very close second is clarity. We're trying to make sense of things for people, and there's no point using long words or words where you have to sort of pause and think, oh, now just do I know what that means? There's no point. There's no point showing off with long words. Just nice, simple, short sentences. And I think actually over time, having done it now for so long, I think I in real life have become more like that. I speak quite clearly with short sentences. I sometimes think my vocabulary has narrowed because I'm so interested in clarity that has happened. I mean,
that's no bad thing, I think. Yes, Chris.
I was going to ask you a question, actually, Reeta, just listening to your answer there. Do you think, because I've started in recent years doing more presenting, but not that much. But what I've found, and I wonder if this has been your experience, that being a correspondent makes me a better presenter, and doing some presenting makes me a better correspondent. They are different jobs, and they stretch different journalistic muscles. I'm always conscious when I do presenting that responsibility of presenting other people's journalism well, as opposed to my own, is it you feel I feel the burden of that. It's one thing screwing up your own piece, it's something else kind of screwing up somebody else's. But I find that the two are complementary, even though they are different. Has that been your experience?
Completely. So I am definitely a better presenter for having been a correspondent and for still doing a certain amount of reporting. Not that much this last year because of COVID, but I still have done a fair amount.
Oh, you were on tonight, weren't you?
Well, I was on today. That's true. Yes. Good. Hey. So yeah, definitely. It's and I think it also helps the way in which the audience views you as well. When you're telling people stuff, it lends to the idea that you have some authority because you've gone out and done it yourself. But absolutely, when you're presenting other people's pieces, it's, if you can talk to the correspondent, I always do try and talk to the correspondent or the producer working with them if I feel slightly unsure as to quite what the emphasis is in the piece, or, how it's going to start or whatever, because you want to, it's a collective effort, isn't it? It's teamwork, it's completely collaborative. And, we are there to inform the audience. It sounds slightly Poe, doesn't it? But that's what we're for.
No, but you mentioned, of course, that accuracy is really important, and I'm aware, for example, that there was an issue around Sarah Smith's reporting. She's, of course, the Scotland editor. When she had to apologise for reporting that Alex Salmond had called for Nicola Sturgeon to resign, and he claims that he did not actually put it as strongly as that. So I'm also interested, I think, in the kind of the times that we live in terms of accuracy also, just in terms of fairness and balance, and especially, you've both covered politics. BBC's obviously and other broadcasters are very aware of balance. So Chris, obviously you kind of come out of, you respond to, a political speech or kind of any election results. And I imagine sometimes they're not quite unscripted, but they're more responsive, aren't they? That you're responding to something that's a very live situation. So how do you ensure that there's balance and fairness in live reporting?
Yeah, I think fairness is the absolute key. The sort of fundamental of the idea of due impartiality, which is kind of baked into the DNA of British broadcast news, is about leaving your own views at the door, and constantly as well, on top of that, to come back to Rita's point, seeking to be clear. I kind of see my job as a political correspondent as being a kind of an interpreter of the business of this postcode that affects everyone's lives, conducted often in a language that is opaque, arcane, quite often wrapped in all sorts of sophistry and euphemism and clever language to try and mask real meaning. And sometimes there's a good reason for doing that. I don't mean to and never seek to portray politicians in in a cynical way, I genuinely don't think that's our job. I do not think it's our job to sort of talk down the political process. I think politics is an admirable calling for people to be drawn to, irrespective of their political view. But our job is to report accurately and clearly. And I think you can make a decent fist of being a political correspondent if you always think clear. How is this? How do I say this so that it's understandable? And here come all of the broadcasting cliches, but the busy mum on the school run at the traffic lights listening to Zoe Ball on Radio 2. This is a piece I might be writing at the end of a late shift at midnight the night before. How do I write those 40 seconds so that, well, A, she doesn't turn over and put magic on instead, and B, ideally, actually understands, comes away from those 30 seconds a little better informed about what's going on than she was at the start. And I think that attention to kind of clarity is even more important than it's ever been because of the range of distractions that we have when we're consuming the stuff that we are pumping out. I guess, in a previous generation, you might have reasonably assumed if you were sitting down watching the 10 o'clock news or whatever, that, okay, you might be distracted by whoever else is in the living room, but you might have a reasonable amount of the attention span of the viewer in the living room. Now, of course, we're all sitting watching the telly, with one of these in our hands, aren't we? And with a moment's hesitation, we're looking at social media or whatever it might be. So that the importance of clarity and using that simple language that punches through. It's not about dumbing down. It's not about not doing stories that are hard to tell. It's the opposite of that. We should be doing all of those things, telling stories that are hard to tell, reporting from difficult parts of the world, all that kind of stuff. But helping people to understand it and recognizing that the vast majority of the audience, unlike journalists, are not paid to watch the news. They'll be interested, but they won't necessarily have followed every twist and turn. And we can very easily, with a duff phrase there or a lack of clarity in the next sentence or whatever, just lose people. You either literally lose people because they turn off, or mentally lose them because they've lost the train of the narrative of the story that you're telling. But yeah, it all comes down to language. I think as a political correspondent, listening to the language you're hearing and then trying to broadcast in a language that people can understand.
We've got lots and lots of questions again. Of course, yeah, Rita, of course.
So just listening to Chris talking about impartiality, leaving our opinions at the door, which is absolutely baked in. But it is good to know what you think about something that's happened, but to know it professionally, if you know what I mean. So it's not your personal opinion, but it's your professional opinion that you've heard this, and on balance, you think this is what's going on. And it's also your job, if you don't entirely know what's going on, to say so, to say, definitely, right, well, we still don't know X, Y, and Z. These are the questions that still need to be answered, because news so often is like finding bits of the jigsaw, bit up here, bit down there. You can't see the whole picture. So sometimes you have to say, well, we know this and we don't know this. It doesn't quite add up, and that's because we don't know X, Y, and Z. And I think this is something that, over time, this is where it's experience, isn't it, Chris, that you sort of sense that, don't quite know everything that's going on here. And you have to have the confidence to say that, actually. You're not doing the viewer or the listener a disservice by saying that.
Completely. And I think there are some things journalistically that it is in the minds of a reasonable viewer or listener, they would expect you to know, because it's something that you could easily find out and you should know if you are wearing that title of political correspondent or whatever it is. And there are other things that are unknowable. And therefore, I had a moment a couple of years ago where inadvertently something I did on Breakfast TV ended up going a bit viral because I talked about not having the foggiest idea about what was going to happen. And I took a bit of heat from some about that because people said, well, surely you're paid to know what's going to happen. And I said, well, yeah, up to a point. But we should always be honest about what is unknowable. This is in the middle of the Brexit process where we didn't know whether the Prime Minister, Theresa May at the time, would survive another week. Would there be a general election? Would Brexit happen? That's why politics was so live at that moment, because all of the fundamentals, who's in charge, how long will they be in charge, will the decision of the British people in 2016 be honoured or not? Will there be another referendum? Blah, 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 blah. All of those questions were unknowable, and nobody knew them. Not even the participants in the drama knew them. They knew what they wanted to happen. Everyone could tell you in this postcode what they wanted to happen with Brexit, and that's fine, and that was part of the story. But they couldn't tell you what was going to happen. And in that moment, I thought, I'm just going to be really honest, because that's the essence of this story right now. We don't know what is going to happen. And yeah, I wouldn't have done that a few years earlier, because I'd have thought, it would have made me look sort of weak or inadequate or not good enough at my job. And in the end, it was, as Reeta says, that it was me assessing what we know and what we don't know, what it's reasonable to try and find out. And obviously, as a journalist, your job is to try and find out as much as you possibly can, but also accept, covering politics, there will be stuff they won't tell you, because it's perfectly reasonable that decision making does happen in private. And then explain to the audience why it is we know what we know and we don't know what we don't know, and therefore the range of options that could come from here.
Reeta, I just want to ask you, I mean, just in terms of live reporting, is there a way you can verify information? So I'm thinking maybe specifically about the Clapham Vigil. So if you're covering that in a live environment, obviously you have the pictures, but you may not have maybe a balanced view maybe from the police authorities at that point. So you maybe get vox pops from the demonstrators, people who are there. So in terms of, do you have any just your thoughts in terms of how, again, you can verify information in that kind of, again, breaking story that you may be covering live?
I think just by getting as big a range of opinions as you possibly can. I mean, I'm assuming, if you ask this question, that, you know, assuming that I wasn't there, so you're doing it in the studio and you've just got sort of stuff coming in, all you can do is ask pertinent questions of as wide a range of people as possible. You know, in this day and age, everybody's a journalist, aren't they? Because we've all got smartphones and all sorts of user-generated content comes into the building. And, you know, if you're getting 10, 15 pieces of film coming in, all showing much the same thing, I mean, it's very unlikely that it's going to be fake or a hoax or whatever. You still want to caveat your language by saying we're being sent in this stuff, you know, making it clear that it's not filmed by us, but, you know, you're getting the same story over and over again. You know, it probably is true, isn't it? I mean, I think we were all struck by when the Prime Minister commented on it, and I think possibly the Home Secretary as well, Chris will correct me if I'm wrong, they both talked about the images and the scenes, unacceptable scenes, I can't quite remember the phrase, and it was worth us sticking to that formulation, because I think they were using it in a specific way. I don't think they were casting doubt on the veracity of it, but I think there was just a slight distancing from, you know, from what we can see. It didn't look good. That was the reading, wasn't it, Chris?
Yeah, and again, it comes back to that point, doesn't it? That I think, I mean, obviously always journalistically, but you're particularly conscious of it in a live unfolding event, or even, as we found out in October, in a live not unfolding event where you're waiting for something, that language, paying real attention to the language that's coming from, well, particularly official sources when things start bubbling out, because again, they will often, even in the subtext, nod to what they don't know as well as what they do know, and it can be very tempting in the rush of those moments to sub down something that you might have seen from the police or whatever it might be, depending on the story, to something more stark than they are actually quite subtly communicating. And again, I think that's, you know, that's the job of the journalist to revere that detail and be very careful around language. Language is, I always like to say on these kind of things, you know, that language is our currency, isn't it, in journalism, in broadcast journalism in particular, and so sort of spend it wisely, really.
Yeah, the language, actually, I was quite interested because you've brought that up. You know, I'm just interested to see, actually, are you seeing an increased sensitivity around language and tone in, you know, in maybe even in current months, you know, whether it's around diversity or inclusion, you know, around language around BAME or transgender. I mean, I would just wonder, again, in a live situation, whether that makes it quite difficult to navigate the sensitivities of language increasingly.
Yes, it can do. It can do, and I think that's fine. I think that's fair enough. That's how our society is changing and evolving and opening up. So I don't have a problem with that. I have a greater problem, I think, with some of the less nice aspects of social media, where things that can be said in a live situation in the studio are misinterpreted and viewed as malevolent, rather than simply live language that's, you know, you're coping in the situation. It doesn't happen to me too often, but it has happened that things that I've said or questions I've asked have been used selectively and then circulated on Twitter, and it's very, it's always very upsetting, you know, and unfair. And I wish that that didn't happen. I really do. But I mean, you know, the genie's out of the bottle, and it does happen, of course. And to colleagues, there are certain of our colleagues who I think have to live with completely unacceptable levels of abuse sometimes, only for doing their job. I find it profoundly depressing. And it is, I'm afraid, often women colleagues as well.
Yeah, no, I do think that tendency that exists, and we see every day, where things will be sort of ripped out of context, where, you know, there might be that 15-second little, you know, question that a presenter's asked or answer that the correspondent's given. And of course, I mean, firstly, let's be honest, in live broadcast situations, you do sometimes make mistakes, or you use language that in a more scripted or formal environment you might not use. But then you hope, and touch wood, this is the case most of the time, that the live viewer understands the context, because they can see it as a long form conversation where two people, hopefully, who have got reasonable things to talk about to one another, are ad-libbing. And that is different from something that you've spent ages slaving over, and then it's gone past a sub-editor, and you've pontificated about a particular word. That's the kind of normal thing that goes on in a newsroom. But yeah, as Reeta says, I guess that kind of that genie is out of the bottle. And of course, you know, of course, some people will use it to try and further a particular prejudice that they have about a person or a program or a, you know, organization or whatever. But I suppose that world of instant feedback is it's not going away.
No.
We've had a question that someone's just asked for you, Chris, where they noticed that you're tweeting actually during this talk as well, Chris.
Oh, sorry, it rumbled me.
No, it's fine.
Well, it's funny enough, it makes the very point. I mean, it makes I was kind of making the very point that, I was illustrating the very point that Reeta was speaking to as I tweeted, which was, curiously, there's this story this evening breaking around the Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon story in Scotland, and I just noticed that Michael Fabricant, who is a Conservative MP, was tweeting about, isn't it extraordinary? Sky News are blah blah all over this story, and the BBC News isn't doing it. I just noticed on my screen behind my laptop here, the news channel is on, and Nick Eardley, my colleague, political correspondent, was on the air at that moment, the very moment the tweet appeared. So I just replied and said, well, Nick Eardley's on the telly right now, because I just thought that is the sort of thing that will get hundreds and hundreds of retweets, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. You know, I don't always wade into these things, but with something like that, I know Michael quite well as well. He would see it as a bit of joshing, really. But that kind of stuff, that kind of thing is, you know, can't help myself wading into that. Anyway, sorry, I'll focus my attention.
No, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. I mean, of course, you don't work in isolation. You are, of course, you know, your job is also to interview people. So, Reeta, I was interested to understand in terms of how you brief people that may be, again, live in the studio. They may not be officials, they may just be members of the public. Is there a risk there, and how do you contain that risk? Obviously, against the background of, you know, not having any issues with defamation, for example. So, and the same question to you, Chris, in the context of you obviously hosting any questions where you know, proactively invite members of the audience to kind of come in with their questions. So it is that there is a risk there, obviously, Reeta. So how is that risk contained?
Well, everybody should be talked to before they come on the air. Usually not by me, usually by a producer, usually by a member of the production team. And if there are legal issues, that's something that the producer will talk through with the contributor, and then maybe take advice. I mean, I think it's rare that things get referred to the lawyer. And I think if you were worried about specific legal issues, you may not want to put them on live. I suspect that by and large, we would err on the side of caution. But most contributors, the vast majority, it's not a question of sort of legalese or anything. It's more a question of finding out what they want to say and what their point of view is and how you can get the best interview out of them. So I don't necessarily always need a brief for the interviewees, but I think if a producer has gone to the trouble of talking to them, I would like to know, where they're coming from. So it's that sort of thing. And there are times inevitably where you feel, you haven't done the right interview because you know, the interviewee has come out with stuff that you didn't know about, or the really interesting thing has come right at the end when the director is saying wind please, and you sort of think, I wish I'd known that at the beginning. But you know, that's live TV, and you just store it up for next time the issue happens, and you get them on again.
Chris, obviously, again, you deal with many politicians, but let's say many members of the public on any questions. Yeah, are you very aware of when you have to, you know, stop people, or you know, just maybe redress a balance when people may have quite strong political opinions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things there. There's strong political opinions, and then there's issues where you're conscious of potential legal ramifications. And some weeks I'm more conscious of the likelihood of that than others. And actually, last week was a classic example. So obviously, there was lots of conversation on the programme about the Sarah, or springing from the Sarah Everard case. And so we spoke to the lawyer before we went on air. I then briefed the panel before we went on air, saying, look, we never tell you what the questions are, but you won't be surprised that we're likely to be talking about this. That is our jumping off point for a broader conversation about the safety of women. It's not about the particular case, because obviously there's all the legal ramifications around that. And I said to them, look, let's, you know, you'll probably want to refer to her by name. Obviously, you know, at this point, I think it's still the case, the BBC hasn't named the alleged suspect. So I sort of ran that home to them off the air. I then made it clear on the air, on legal advice, that what had happened, but that we were using this as a jumping off point. That was going to offer us cover in a situation where one of the panelists then started blurting out stuff that would cause us legal trouble. I also had a form of words for what I was going to do if any of them had said something that would be obviously in contempt of court, which is the big fear at that kind of stage of a story like that. We've had other instances there. We had one, seems an eternity ago now, because we were out on the road. We were in Winchester, and we had Owen Jones, the left-wing commentator, on the panel, and he started talking about a court case that I wasn't familiar with. And immediately when someone does that on the 8th, I was thinking, blimey, what is this? And he's a savvy guy, but he's a very passionate guy. And I thought, he's savvy, so you'll be careful, I hope. But you know, we're broadcasting this, and I'm chairing it, so I've got to be. And I scribbled something to the producer sitting next to me, saying, "Is this over?" Because the way he was talking about it sounded like the case was over. In which case, it's fine. Touch wood, he's being accurate, but it's not still a live case. I didn't really want to prompt him with another question for fear that he would dig in even deeper. And obviously, we're on a stage in front of a live audience. There's no fading him out, or you know, it's got to be quite subtly managed. Thankfully, there was some rapid Googling that went on, and I was told in my ear, it's fine, the case is over and he's represented it fairly. Phew. Because that's a potentially tricky situation. And all of this is going on whilst I'm supposed to be actually listening to what the others are all saying. So, but that's the nature of live broadcast. And there's an element of a live defense when it comes to the potential for legal action during live broadcast, but only if you've mitigated against the likelihood of it happening and responded appropriately at the point at which it did. And so, yeah, that keeps you on your toes, live broadcasting wise. And as ever, it's the stuff that comes out of nowhere that is the stuff that tests you. Because, you know, last week around the Everard thing, I thought it's fairly unlikely they're going to start doing it. We've done it a few weeks before with the salmon sturgeon case, making sure people were fairly careful. But it was fairly unlikely someone was going to say something really, really legally dodgy. But if they did, it would be huge. Somebody mentioning mid-answer some court case that immediately makes you think, woof, that's what you're always listening out for. And the lesson I've learned in the very short time, I've only done any questions for 18 months, but in those 18 months, the key lesson I've learned about it, the key skill, listening. You know, everything else, you know, writing nice scripts is great, asking good questions is great, but if you don't listen, on a number of times I'll listen back because any questions is repeated on a Saturday lunchtime, and I'll think, why didn't I ask that? I'm actually shouting at the presenter on the radio, and it's me. and I've learned, listening when I'm on the air. The most important thing I do for those 50 minutes is listen. And it's quite. When I started, I wasn't doing it as well. Hopefully, I've got better at it. Listen.
Hopefully. Hopefully. I just want to ask you, obviously, you know, we've seen reporting and the way that news is communicated over these days of lockdown and COVID has changed very dramatically. So it's not unusual to see reporters, you know, filing reports live from their homes. Obviously, kind of less interaction with people that you interview, those endless Zoom interviews as well. So Reeta, just wanted to hear you kind of your views on that. Have you found it a struggle? Is it now the norm? And is it a pattern that you will see continue? Do you think that will continue now? You know, instead of sending out lots of camera crews up and down the country, do you think news has now set the agenda that actually, even in terms of live rolling news or the main bulletins, this is the format that we now will see?
It's a really hard question to answer. I mean, I frankly don't know. I think there will be change, but I just don't know to what extent. You know, the BBC recently said that is anticipating having about 40% of the workforce working from home. Now, whether that means 40% of the workforce from home or that 40% of some people's time will be working from home with the rest of the time in the newsroom, I'm not sure, but certainly more of a sense of more work not being done in the newsroom. So it feels to me that it is bound to have some effect on the way in which our news looks. I'm talking only about TV here. And then, of course, there are all these announcements today that, you know, we're still digesting. So I don't know. I think, you know, I think if it's factual interviews, very much for information, then a Zoom interview is okay. I mean, it obviously doesn't look anything like as nice, but it's okay. But
does that matter? Sorry, do you think that matters? That
yeah, well, it does matter. It hurts me a bit. Yeah, I think it hurts everybody who works in TV, because we're all creative people as well. We're into information and communication first off, but it is also about the look of it. It's televisual, it's visual. Things that look nice are just more pleasing. And certainly everybody who makes TV packages, I mean, they're craftspeople, and everybody who does that, the camera person, the shoot edit, the producer, the reporter, you're all making something lovely. The phrase is painting a piece, isn't it? And I think that's not by accident. You know, there is something artistic about it. So we will lose if we don't go back to what we had before. I don't think we'll necessarily be informationally poorer. Sorry if that's a horrible new word I've invented, but I don't think in terms of the actual information we'll be poorer, but in terms of the look of things we will. And there are certain interviews that, you know, you just do lose if you're doing down the line. The more emotional ones, the more human ones, or the ones with a bit of humour, where, you know, you can read people's body language, you can cut into people more. And certainly conducting discussions is much harder. If you're doing any more than one person, you've just got to flip from one to the other. You can never get a good old discussion going, or even a really good row, which, let's face it, can be very entertaining as well, you know.
Yeah.
Chris, do you miss the pre-COVID days?
Oh, completely. Yeah, there's nothing positive about all of this as far as I can see. I mean, I think what it'll mean, who knows what it'll mean in the longer term, and I'm sure there'll be a great desire professionally as well as personally for lots of us to go back to revering all the things that we took for granted beforehand. But at the same time, I suppose those things that never happened before, because that's just not how it's done. If you think about, say, a television piece where you wouldn't take a clip from somebody down their webcam, because no, we don't do that. I suppose that genie is out of the bottle, and whilst we'll try and do, I guess, more that is crafty and looks nice and gets us out and about, an editor will no longer be able to say, well, we don't do that anymore. We don't do that because, you know, well, we didn't we, for a few years, and why not? The webcam's all right, you know, that sort of thing. On the point of interviewees face to face versus down the line, so I've gone from doing, with my Any Questions hat on, 4 panelists in the same room as me at the same table in front of an audience of several hundred in front of us. So it's a very much in the room theatrical experience, to me sitting on my own in a studio in Broadcasting House, and sometimes at home myself, and all 4 panelists in different places at home with their earphones on, trying to have a round table discussion around 5 different round tables, and none of us can see each other, and trying to have a conversation, either either a conversation in a well, hopefully a constructive sense, and then sometimes a bit of fireworks. Depends on the topics and the panelists. One thing I've noticed, well, two things actually that spin off from the same point. I think that I'm perhaps a bit more aggressive as an interviewer when the guest is not with me.
Right.
And I think that's partly because for all of the wonders of technology, we're all flatter and more one-dimensional. I mean, I think it's just inevitable when we are talking into a screen rather than, so we lose non-verbal communication, that raised eyebrow, that facial expression that gives away quite a lot. And I think one of the additional reasons why I might be occasionally a bit more aggressive, I hopefully that word is never too accurate about the way I approach things, so it's not really me, but I also think when people are appearing remotely, either one-on-one as an interview or particularly in a discussion, when I'm doing any questions, one of the panelists I have to go to fourth in answer to the first question. So the program's been on air for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 minutes. They've not been on yet. So when I come to them, if you put yourself in their shoes, they've given up their Friday night, they're sat in their kitchen, they've had to shoo their children upstairs or whatever it might be, and they're thinking, this guy hasn't put me on the radio yet. When you get asked to then talk, you're going to make the most of it, aren't you? And they can't see me, so they can't see me thinking, come on, you've had a fair crack of the whip here. I don't really want to interrupt you because you have come forth, but you are waffling a little bit now. But my only way of controlling you is to verbally interject. On a panel, face to face, and it's radio, there's no cameras, I can look like some sort of traffic manager, sort of, going things like that, to try and get somebody to slow them down. I mean, not quite like that, but it's sometimes tempting. But you can do all of that kind of thing to sort of choreograph the listener experience at home. Obviously, when no one can see each other, and I've decided that doing Zoom when you're doing a radio discussion, trying to look at people on a screen would be even worse. So we don't do that. But it does mean my only mechanism for intervening is verbally, and that means I do sound a bit more interrupting. But yeah, people go on for longer when they're remote, and certainly speaking personally, I think I'm a bit more, I don't know, is aggressive the right word? I think it probably is sometimes, and I'm not saying that's a good thing, by the way. I don't think it is, but it's just something I've noticed.
We're just coming to the end of the hour. Just maybe a quick question. It's come up from people watching quite a lot, so I will ask it. People are keen to see what has been the most memorable experience of your career in journalism for each of you, whether that's good, memorable for good reasons or bad reasons, I suppose, given how many times you've done live reporting. So Reeta, anything that really sticks out for you as a memorable time in your illustrious career in news?
Well, I suppose I was given the chance as a presenter to do more foreign reporting, and I really loved that. I was somebody who, age 25, would have wanted to be a foreign correspondent for various reasons. It never quite happened. So to be able to go off and do big stories abroad was a real treat for me. Not that they were glamorous stories, far from it. I did lots of refugee stories. I went to Bangladesh 3 times to report on the Rohingyas. I did the European migrant crisis of the boats coming over from Libya to Italy, and I did that a couple of times. So those were both very memorable because they meant a lot. They felt like really important stories. Yeah, I would say probably those two. Those two really stick in the head, and I'm proud of them.
Chris, I expect you've got quite a few. You can take your pick, I imagine, Chris.
Yeah, I think for me, the moments when you're telling a story that you know because of the strength of the story that you're telling is compelling, and people will be. It really matters to people, whether that be the result of a general election or the result of the Brexit referendum, or something like the long chat that Reeta and I had back in October, where you knew that people were turning on. They weren't turning on for Reeta or I. We were just the broadcasters of the news. It was the information that we hopefully were gathering and then broadcasting by the Prime Minister that people were turning on for. And that's what journalism's all about. And when you're in possession of a story that you know really matters to people, and in some instances everyone, like that story, at least for people in England that day, that's hugely kind of compelling and satisfying. And then it's the kind of first moments, the first Any Questions I did, the first time I presented Breakfast TV, the first time I broadcast Full Stop. You never forget those moments. But then as a final thought, And we've been shielded from this journalistically, or certainly I have, doing this job for quite a while because of the pandemic, and before that Brexit and the Scottish independence referendum and the kind of tumult of politics of the last 10 years. That there's a huge amount of satisfaction in telling a mediocre story well. You know, we should always aspire to tell good stories well. Lots of time in journalism, because daily news journalism is quite, you know, it's forgettable because it's the story of the day, isn't it? And it doesn't matter once it's told. The whole yesterday's chip paper kind of outdated outdated form of words for journalism. But trying to, as a correspondent, for the however many minutes you're on the air, be as interesting, compelling, relevant, not overselling a story, but telling it well, thinking carefully about the language, and hoping that at the end of it, the person watching, listening, reading is a little bit better informed. I think that's all we ever aspire to do. It's not that, in the grand scheme of things, it's not like putting out fires or teaching the next generation to read or saving lives, is it? But in its own way, telling good stories well on good days, and quite often telling forgettable stories as well as possible. You know, storytelling is it's a fascinating way and compelling way to make a living, and I get a huge amount of satisfaction out of telling those stories as well.
Well, I'm sure we'll all remember that Halloween night that we started off with as well. So yes, completely in our memories. So thank you both very much for your time this evening. Chris and Reeta, it's been really wonderful to have you. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. I'm sure it's been extremely helpful to our audience as well. And yeah, I wish you both all the very best as the BBC undergoes its restructure as well. So hope that all kind of works out well. Thank you both very much for your time, and thank you to our audience for joining as well, and thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having us. Thanks, Zaiba. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.